Now, I wouldn't dream to make you. Now, I wouldn't dream. Now, I wouldn't dream of suggesting that you all go out and you buy this book. Hi, Will. Hi. Hi. Yes, Wills. Now, I wouldn't dream of suggesting that you all need to go out and get this book. So, now I wouldn't dream of suggesting that the object here is to make you all go out and buy the book. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to give you How to Prepare for Climate Change, the talk. So now I wouldn't be so crass as to suggest that all of you have to run out and buy this book. Instead, I'm going to treat you to How to Prepare for Climate Change, the talk. Now, in 2007, this guy, John Holdren, who was Barack Obama's chief science advisor, gave the New York Times a famous quote that goes like this: "We basically have three choices when it comes to climate change: mitigation, which means trying to stop climate change; adaptation, which means trying to cope with it; and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be." So it seems to me that everything we've ever seen about climate change is that first thing. It's mitigation. It's fly less and buy an electric car and eat less red meat and burn fewer fossil fuels. And that's all super important. We need to keep doing that for sure. But we have heard it 1,000 times. What I found very odd is that we never hear anything about the second part of that formula, the adaptation. So that's what this book and this talk is about. Now, I am going to warn you, the talk falls roughly into two parts. There's a depressing part, and then there's a shakily reassuring part. After much internal reflection, I decided to do the depressing part first and end on the shakily reassuring part. Please don't give me a hard time on the really bad photoshopping job of the theatrical masks. I really did try to Google shakily reassuring masks. And if you've ever wondered if there's such a thing as a Google search that comes up with nothing, you've just got one. So, okay, quick crash course on how the greenhouse effect works. The sun's rays heat up the surface of the Earth. That energy bounces back as radiation, as infrared heat, which gets trapped by this outer layer of gases in the atmosphere. It's carbon dioxide, it's methane, it's water vapor. That is all perfectly natural and totally the way it's supposed to be. If we didn't have that blanket, the Earth would be a frozen ice ball and we would all be dead. What's happened recently, though, is that blanket has gotten thicker. I don't like at all the term greenhouse effect. I think that's a terribly misleading term. Most Americans have no idea that a greenhouse is 20 degrees warmer inside than outside. They just don't know what it means. I think if we want to really communicate well with the public, we should use terms like the dog and the car effect. It is precisely the same scientific effect, The sun's rays come into the car, they heat up the upholstery, convert it to infrared heat, which cannot bounce out the windows. It gets trapped, it gets hot in there. And if you ever have left a dog in the car while you're out shopping, we're the dog. Now, as I've said, the global warming effect is very natural. It is part of history. As you can see on this graph, every 100,000 years or so, we have a huge spike, and with it, rising carbon dioxide levels, rising temperatures, and rising sea levels. What's different with this last one, though, if you take a look at the far right of this graph, check this out. That's what's happened in the last 150 years. The carbon dioxide levels have gotten much higher, much faster than they have in any time in human history. And if you were to zoom in on that graph and take a look at the temperatures during that time, now, if we zoom in on that last 150 years to see the carbon dioxide levels and then superimpose the measured temperature of the Earth, you see that there's a pretty good correlation. This is pretty much why scientists think there's a relationship between the greenhouse gases and the rising temperature of the Earth. So all told, we are, as Al Gore likes to say, using the sky as an open sewer. We are dumping 152 million tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere a day. These are some of the biggest sources. And it's not just the Earth heating up. It is freak heat waves, but it's also freak cold snaps. Those of you who have been reading the news know that Texas experienced something like this last week. It's not just devastating droughts, but it's also intense rains. It's not just intense flooding, but it's water shortages. It's wildfires and hurricanes and loss of biodiversity and ticks and mosquitoes and loss of crops and soon the migration of hundreds of millions of people out of unlivable land into more livable land. And it's all these wacky effects that you don't expect. It's shifting tornado regions, smaller beaches, more expensive chocolate, more kidney stones, smaller goats, lower PSAT scores. In fact, this is why I can't stand the term global warming. It makes people think that all this is about is warmer weather in the summer. This is why that dumb senator walked into Congress with a snowball in 2015 and said, "You can't tell me the earth is warming." It's all of the above. I've heard the term climate chaos or climate breakdown or global weirding. All much better terms, much more descriptive than global warming. Now, I know 2020 was not a great year for most people. We had our mind on things like the pandemic. But believe it or not, the climate change crisis kept chugging right along even during the pandemic. America won all kinds of awards. It was the hottest year ever measured. It featured the hottest temperature ever measured on the planet, over 130 degrees. That was in Death Valley in the summer. We had the most devastating wildfires ever measured in California and the western states. 5 million acres burned. That's the equivalent of the entire state of Connecticut and Delaware and Rhode Island. Overall, you can see that millions of acres are burning more and more every passing year. This is a picture taken in San Francisco at 12 noon. It had the worst air quality measured on the planet Earth, 4 times worse than Beijing, China. And the plume of smoke from those West Coast fires crossed the entire continental United States. The skies were yellow and hazy in New York City. We were not alone, of course. You probably read about the devastating wildfires in Australia. There were even wildfires in Siberia. I mean, freaking Siberia. It's supposed to be a frozen tundra. They set world Siberian heat records 100.5 degrees Fahrenheit in the frozen wasteland of Siberia. This may be the most perfect, bitterly ironic photo of the year. Wear a mask, wash your hands, come join us. Burned down in the California wildfires. We also had the most hurricanes ever measured last year. As you probably know, we name our hurricanes alphabetically after boys and girls. Last year, we had so many hurricanes, we exhausted the list of alphabetical names, and we had to start using Greek letters to name the hurricanes. Part of this is because 93% of the trapped heat goes into the oceans, not the land. And I don't know if you remember from your fifth grade science classes, the famous water cycle. Water from the oceans evaporate into the air, turn into clouds, rains down, creates more water, evaporates, and so on. So as the water heats up in the oceans, we're getting a more intense water cycle. And if you look at the overall graph of extreme rainstorms, you'll see that in the last 50 years or so, it's gotten much more intense. Worldwide, in fact, we've been getting flooding all over the world, including the U.S. This was Washington, D.C. last year, 6.5 inches of rain in 2 hours. You may have read about the dams that broke in Michigan, flooding out entire towns because there was so much rain. Entire cities flooded out, and that's not even counting the crop loss. Last year, millions and millions of crops couldn't be grown or sold because they were flooded out. And what happens in climate change is this alternation of drought, which makes the ground all hard and dry, and then intense rains, and the rainwater now has nowhere to go. It can't soak into the earth. So that 1-2 punch is just devastating for the breadbasket states. There really is like one lighter side of all this, and it's this. This is the Noah's Ark Replica Museum in Kentucky. They actually filed for $1 million in insurance claims from flooding. The Noah's Ark Museum from flooding. It's not just rain, it's hurricanes. You may have heard of this little storm, Hurricane Katrina. 1,800 people dead. Or this one, Hurricane Sandy. That one hit us here in Westport. The biggest hurricane ever measured, 1,000 miles across. And when I say storm surge, by the way, I'm talking about this effect where as the slope of the ocean floor approaches dry land, and as the wind pushes water on shore, the two wind up making this huge mound of water that rises up. The storm surge in Hurricane Katrina was 28 feet tall. Can you imagine being on dry land and seeing this 3-story building's worth of water coming at you? Terrifying. This was New York City during Hurricane Sandy. This is the risk of a Sandy-level hurricane hitting New York City. Used to be you'd get a storm like that once every 500 years. By 2017, it was once in 25 years. And by 2030, we're talking a storm of that size every 5 years. And those of you who live in Westport remember Hurricane Sandy very well. We all lost power for a long time. It was cold. I had 3 little kids here in the house. We had no heat, no internet, no electricity, no power, no refrigerator, no TV. It was bad. It was blankets and candles and reading books and trying to talk about how much we appreciate the conveniences of life when we have them. So if you add all these things up, all these natural disasters, you can see a general trend over the entire world. We are getting more disasters just since 1980. Now, the Yale Center for Climate Change Communications does this poll of American attitudes toward climate change once or twice a year. And in the most recent one, they asked, do you think all this is natural systems going haywire, or do you think the greenhouse gases we're pumping out are responsible? And in the study that just came out, 29% of Americans are deniers at this point. That's the lowest number. It's dropping about 5% every time they do the survey. It's not like half of Americans. It's 29%. And by the way, I don't really care. For the purposes of my book, it doesn't matter whether you think it's natural or not. The point is, systems are going haywire. You need to prepare. You need to read a book like this. Okay, so this brings us to the book. The book is full of chapters like where to live, how to build, how to insure, how to invest, how to talk to your children. And it also has chapters on preparation for individual disasters like flood and heat waves, hurricanes, mosquitoes and ticks, and so on. So Bill Harmer was really antsy about my not going over that delicate 11-hour limit for the lengths of these talks. So I'm just going to give you a choice sampling from the book of some of the more interesting points. Everybody asks me, okay, what's the answer to where to live? Now, I will concede that moving is expensive and it rips you apart from your social network. It's not something a lot of people are doing just because of climate, but increasingly it's a factor in where people decide to live. So the basic scheme goes like this. You want to be inland from sea level rise and flooding. And by the way, if you're not familiar with that, well, there's this cool website called Surging Seas, and you can plug in any address and then drag the slider at the left side to see what kind of sea level rise you're going to be experiencing. And for every 1 foot of sea level rise up, you get about 300 feet of flooding inland horizontally. So here, ladies and gentlemen, is Westport, Connecticut in the next few decades. You can see how the water will flood the shorelines. I mean, Longshore, gone. Sherwood Island, mostly gone. Here's Miami. Miami is really scary. It's a low-lying town, and you can't build seawalls because the water's coming up from underneath you, too. If you zoom out, I mean, really the entire southern tip of Florida is just gone. Do not buy property in Miami. They're getting what's called sunny day flooding. This is not during a flood. This is not during a hurricane. This is just everyday high tides at certain times of year. Just floods coming up from the storm drains that are supposed to release the water out of the streets. This is having an effect on real estate in Miami already, and it's only going to get worse in the coming years as the public becomes more aware that flooding is a disaster, and flood insurance in Miami, while you can still get it, is massively expensive. So basically you want to be north far enough to escape the heat and the mosquitoes and the ticks. You want to be west far enough to avoid the hurricanes. The entire western half of the U.S. is in a long-term drought. So you want to be someplace where there's a lot of fresh water forever, and you want to be east far enough to avoid the wildfires. We get our drinking water from places like aquifers, which are these giant underground depositories, and they're now at record low levels all over the world. This is the lake formed by the Hoover Dam, Lake Mead. 25 million Americans get their water from this reservoir. It's now down to a third of its regular level. I don't know what those people are going to do for drinking water. So if you add up all these factors, where are the best climate havens to move, to live? It's the Great Lakes. It's the grand old Rust Belt cities. Anything above the 42nd parallel, and you're pretty much free of all of the disasters like hurricane, fire, flood, the rising sea levels, and you have unlimited fresh drinking water. So in the book, I looked at 14 of these cities, and I chose them not just because of their climate protection, but also, are they good places to live? You know, do they have good culture? Is the cost of living good? What's the populace like? Are there good hospitals and airports? So places like where I grew up, Cleveland, $1 in Westport will buy you $2.71 worth of stuff in Cleveland. So incredible value for the money, and I think ready for an influx of climate migrants over the coming decades. Everybody loves Madison, Wisconsin, a fantastic town. It's on 5 lakes. It's beautiful. It's cold now. It gets cold in the winter, but It's 5 degrees warmer in the winter than it was in 1980. And it's going to keep getting warmer in the winter in the coming years. It keeps getting elected as the nicest city, the best city for families, and so on. Burlington, Vermont is a great town. It feels like a seaside town, but that's not an ocean it's on. That is Lake Champlain, this 500-mile lake. So you get the benefits of a seaside oceanfront town without sea level rise or hurricanes. They have fantastic cheese and maple syrup and ice cream and the lowest crime rate in the United States. This is Buffalo. It's right on Lake Erie. Some of the best medical facilities in the country, cheap land, and yes, really good chicken wings. Another chapter I found interesting was where to invest. You might think it's sort of crass to think of making money as the world ends, but there's actually a good reason to make climate change investments, and that is that when you are investing in clean companies, you are supporting them. You are doing something about mitigation of climate change at the same time that you're profiting from the adaptation. So you might think, well, obviously the place to invest is in solar energy, and in some ways you'd be right. Investments in regular energy stocks like petroleum has been a disaster in the last 10 years. Look at that. Those are petroleum stocks, and the blue line is renewable energy stocks. If you'd invested $1,000 just 4 years ago in clean companies, clean energy, you'd be up 60%. If you'd invested them in Exxon and the oil companies, you'd be down 12%. Now, it is true that solar power is taken off in the US. The capacity is just skyrocketing. Last year, 72% of all the power we installed in this country was solar and wind power. That's fantastic. In fact, not to make fun of Kentucky again, but why not? The Kentucky Coal Mining Museum actually installed solar panels on their roof, and they're saving 10 grand a year by doing that. So solar and wind are taking over for sure. This incredible graph shows coal use in the United States. Last year, for the first time, ladies and gentlemen, renewable power surpassed coal power in the U.S. I think that coal is dead in the United States. There are no more new coal power plants planned, and in many places, it's cheaper to build an entire solar farm for the price of keeping a coal plant running. So the writing is really on the wall. And part of it is because solar power has gotten so cheap. So that's fantastic for the planet, but not good for investors. That is the rub. You see, you really don't want to invest in something whose value is plummeting, right? It's a race to the bottom. It's a commodity. Same thing with wind. Wind energy is also going nuts in the United States, so much more of it, and it's because it's getting so much cheaper. So that's also not a fantastic investment. So how can you take advantage of the explosion in clean energy? Very easy. Invest in the utility companies that are going to be selling them to the states, like NextEra and Xcel Energy. The reason is that many states now have mandates. They are required to buy electricity that was produced cleanly. New York, California, and Hawaii, it's 50% by 2030. So if you're smart, you'll invest in the companies who will have to deliver that to the states. And think about it. If you're a utility company, you no longer have raw materials costs like coal and oil, right? Sunlight and wind are free. But of course, you're not going to stop getting money from the customers. You're not going to lower their prices. Of course not. So lower raw materials, same incoming income, more profit. I think that's all I need to say. Other good sector bets for investment is clean water. As you know, water is going to be desperately in need all over the world. Drought-resistant crops. Some of these companies like Syngenta and Monsanto are developing drought-resistant crops, even though you could say that they're evil companies. They are good investments. And another thing to think about is that the entire farm belt is shifting north as the nation warms up, right? So that means more farms in more places, in new places. So you might want to think about farming equipment companies like John Deere and Navistar. It's also a safe bet to say that all cars are going electric. Every gas car company in the world has now announced that they're moving to electric cars, including, incredibly, General Motors. General Motors, the most calcified corporate, old school, petroleum-based car company in the world, says that in the next 14 years, they're going to get rid of all their gas cars. They're going to be a 100% electric car company. Incredible. Now, it's not necessarily because they're so good at heart and because they love America and they want to preserve the environment. It's mainly because of this. Because the entire world is going to electric. Many countries have mandated that all cars by a certain date must be electric, including, by the way, California. So there will be no more gas cars to buy in these countries and states. So therefore, General Motors and the rest of them are saying, well, I guess we need a product to be able to sell to them. So we're going to start making electric cars. So how do you invest in electric cars? Well, you could, of course, invest in the individual companies that make the cars. But if you're smart, you'll think upstream. What do all electric car companies need to buy? They need to buy big lithium-ion batteries. And there's only 4 companies making them. And they're all in Asia: Panasonic, Amperex, Samsung, and LG Chemical. Or you could invest in the companies that make the components they're all going to need: the connectors, the wires, the capacitors, like Aptiv and Valeo. Or if you think the farthest upstream of all, think of the lithium itself. There are companies who mine the lithium that they're all going to need to make the batteries. Like Albemarle, that's an American company, and then this Chilean company. Those are good bets. Another big topic is insurance in the new age. I had so much fun researching this chapter. By the way, all the research that I did in this book came from reading and from interviewing experts. I'm not an expert on any of these topics: insurance or investment or gardening or psychology. It was all based on researching and reporting and explaining. But insurance turns out to be pretty wild. I'm guessing that at this moment, most of you could not tell me what's in your insurance policy. Most people got it a long time ago. They got the cheapest policy they could get and really never looked at it again. But the world has changed. Right now, 50% of Americans live on the coasts, flood zones, but 18% of Americans who live in flood zones have flood insurance. 18%. Everybody else is sitting ducks. So look at your declarations page, the first page. See what you've got. Here's one thing you may not realize. Flood claims and the amount of claims are skyrocketing these days. More people are flooding every year, not just on the coasts. Ladies and gentlemen, of the 10 most flooded states last year, 7 of them are not on the coasts. We're talking about inland states that just got intense rains and rivers overflooding their banks. So here's the insurance gotcha of the century. Your homeowner's insurance does not cover flooding. It doesn't, I promise. You live in Connecticut, in a coastal state, and you probably don't have flood insurance. So look into it. There's generally only one place to get it. It's from the government. All the private insurance companies have left the business. It just didn't pay to be in the flood insurance business because there was so much flooding. So the government created this thing called the National Flood Insurance Program. It's in desperate trouble. They're $25 billion in debt. The rates are calculated on these really broad, like zip codes or regions of neighborhoods, not like house by house measurements of what your elevation is. So it's going to be reformed this fall in something called Risk Rating 2.0. But in the meantime, insurance companies are in a bind. They are profit-making companies. They really have only 3 levers to pull in the climate change era. They can dump you as a customer, they can raise their rates, or they can withdraw from the state entirely. And that is, in fact, what is happening. Insurance companies are dropping customers in wildfire states and flood states like crazy and raising their rates and getting out of the business. So no one knows exactly what's going to happen with insurance 20 years from now. One of my experts said it could become a luxury for rich people. Finally, I just want to talk about Chapter 8, which summarizes the ways you can prepare for any kind of weather disaster, whether it's fire or flood or hurricane or whatever. There are some simple steps you can take right now. For example, I love this app. It's an American Red Cross app. It's totally free. You can download it in 30 seconds. It's called Emergency. And the way it works is you put in your address, your parents' address, your kids' address, your workplace, and then you can file it away in some folder. That's Wilbur. Thank you. You can file the app away in some folder on your phone and forget about it. If some disaster is ever coming your way, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made one, like a chemical spill or something, this app springs to life and beeps and chimes and gets your attention. So you get early warning. You want to be at the front of that long snaking line of traffic out of town, not the back of it. And for the same reason, that's why the experts all recommend creating a go bag or a bug out bag. This is like a backpack that you keep in the front closet that contains everything you will need if you are told to evacuate the house, if you have to get out. So it's first aid kit and snacks and a flashlight and ID and money and stuff like that. Everyone in the house should have one, and you should be ready to grab it and go when the government says to. One thing that all natural disasters have in common, most of them, is contamination of the water supply. So wildfires, you get nitrates and ash in the water supply. In floods and hurricanes and tornadoes, the sewage system overflows the treatment plants and you get poop in your drinking water. So it turns out that there's some good emergency water already in the walls of your house. If you think about it, your hot water heater, there's 40 or 80 gallons right there. You turn off the intake at the top and turn off the heater, and then you can use the bottom faucet to get water, let it cool, and then you can drink it. Toilets, good source of clean water. I don't mean the bowl, unless you're a golden retriever. I'm talking about the tank. The tank is clean, drinkable water. There are these tanks you can get from Home Depot that can store water long term, and you've got water in the walls of your home, in the pipes. If you have a 2 or 3 story house, there's water in there. So turn on the spigot on the top floor to let the air in, and then on the lower floors you can let the water run. Overall, another thing that's happening in the time of disasters is power failures. The United States gets more power failures than any other country in the developed world, and it's only getting worse. I'm really sensitive in this book to the fact that climate change impacts communities of color and poor communities the worst. So I don't want to make it seem like the only way to protect yourself against a power failure is by buying some big expensive standby generator like Fairfield County people get. Those are great. They run on natural gas, and when the power goes out, they kick in automatically. And by the way, you don't have to get one that fires up and the whole house. After our Hurricane Sandy experience at this house, we got a small one. It's a standby generator, but it only covers the kitchen, so we don't lose all our food in the fridge, and 1 bedroom. So we can get by on that in a disaster. But for $250, you can also get a gas-powered generator at Home Depot. These inverter generators are more expensive, but at least they're quieter and smaller and less stinky. But even for $15, you can get a hand-cranked generator that's enough to recharge your phone, and it's got an emergency radio and a flashlight in it. But this way, at least you've got some source of power. One more thing happens in a lot of disasters, and that is that the cell towers go down. Cell towers are powered by the electrical grid, and when there's a power failure, they don't have power. It happens in all the hurricanes, all the fires, happened during 9/11. So therefore, the last tip that I have for you that's free, a bit of preparation step, is sit down on Saturday with your family and make a plan. What would we do if our cell phones didn't work and we couldn't communicate with each other? So plan now an indoor spot in the house during a big storm where you can all agree to gather, where there aren't windows that can blow in and cut you. So it could be the basement if your basement doesn't flood. It could be an upstairs closet, but just know in advance, figure it out. You also need a spot to meet in the neighborhood if you're not allowed to go back into the house, if the emergency people won't let you in. So let's meet at the craggy tree in front of the Casey's house, something like that. And you'll also want a place in town. Let's meet in front of the library. Let's meet in front of the Stop and Shop. Someplace, again, where if you're separated, somebody's at work, somebody's at school, you'll all know where to gather if you're not allowed onto your street. And that happens in Westport a lot. Police line, do not cross, fallen electrical wires, go somewhere else. So make these plans and then put them on the Notes app of everybody's phone. Put a copy on the fridge, put a copy in the glove compartment, because a couple of years from now, you will have forgotten what you said. Now I have a Connecticut special for you. This is a particular disaster in Connecticut. As the winters are getting warmer and shorter, the bugs are not getting killed off like they used to. So there are ticks and there are mosquitoes. The ticks are loving climate change. The ticks survive the winter better, and because the deer survive the winter better, the ticks ride on the deer, and boom, you've got more deer in more places. Lyme disease cases are steadily rising, particularly here, particularly in the Northeast. The CDC gets 30,000 reported Lyme cases every year, and by the way, they suspect that 10 times as many go unreported. So we're talking maybe 300,000 people a year getting Lyme disease. You do not want this disease. It's awful. It can last your whole lifetime. If you get antibiotics quickly, you can completely kill Lyme disease and come out unscathed. But the problem is there's no good test for it. There are 2 tests and they're both kind of unreliable. And the results of the test differ depending on how long it's been since you got the bite. So I had a lot of fun reading about ticks. I interviewed a tick expert at the University of Rhode Island, and it turns out there's a lot of myths about ticks. I hear people say, oh, they stand in the trees and the branches and wait for you to walk underneath and they jump down and bite you. No, they don't. Ticks don't have, most ticks do not have disease, only certain species. I mentioned antibiotics. Ticks can't fly and they can't jump. They don't even have eyes, so they can't see you. What they do is they stand on a plant on their little hind legs and wave their front arms until some animal or person walks by, and then they grab onto you. The best way to avoid the problem is to put on bug spray that contains DEET. DEET is completely safe. It is one of the most studied chemicals in history. It is not a poison. It is not a insecticide. It's just a repellent. The ticks and the mosquitoes don't like the smell, so they go somewhere else. By the way, ticks require humidity, and if the humidity is lower than 82%, they wither out and die. So one quick tip is to come back from a hike, take off your clothes and stuff them in the dryer on high for 10 minutes. That kills anything that's on your clothes. And while you're standing there, look over your hairy parts for ticks that are on you so that you can pull them off, because ticks can't give you Lyme disease until they've been on you for 24 to 48 hours. You have that long to find and get rid of them. That humidity thing is also why it's a good idea to keep 9 feet of lawn or gravel or dirt between you and the forest. A tick can't cross that. That's like Death Valley to a tick. So that's how to keep them away from your house. And don't believe the internet on its instructions about how to remove a tick. Don't use Vaseline or a match or a candle. Get tweezers, grab it by the head, pull straight out. That's how you get it out. There's a chapter in the book about social unrest. It does happen in times of severe distress. In Hurricane Katrina, my expert said it was like the 1850s. There was no radio or TV. There were no police. There was no internet. There was no electricity, no food or water. It was literally every person for himself. So the question is, how do you prepare for that? Do you get a gun? And I had these long conversations with my editor. Gun ownership is regional. It's cultural. Depends on how you grew up. There are a lot of reasons not to have a gun in your home. The statistics show it. So interestingly, I spoke to a survival expert who is a big gun owner. And he said, actually, a gun is not the best way to protect you when things are breaking down out there. He thinks that light is a better idea. For $10, you can get these solar-powered Home Depot exterior lights for your house. When the bad guys want to do a home invasion or they want to loot you or find food, they don't care about your house. They care about a house, right? And the one that's well lit is the last one they're going to hit up. Similarly, this guy recommended what's called a tactical flashlight. It's this aluminum, unbelievably bright flashlight that law enforcement and the military use. It's blinding and disorienting when you get hit with it. And if you're a bad guy coming up to a house and that thing hits you in the eyes and someone starts yelling at you, get the beep away, you will run. You don't want to tangle with this person. So a great inexpensive addition to keep on hand. I promised you that the talk wouldn't be totally depressing. So the final chapter of the book is called Where to Find Hope. And it turns out there's a lot more hope than I thought there was when I started working on the book. First of all, the United States greenhouse emissions have been steadily dropping. That's fantastic. Mostly it's because we've switched away from coal and toward natural gas, which is a much smaller greenhouse gas emitter. Still a bad one, but nothing like coal. Now, of course, we know that during the last 4 years, the presidential administration of this country did nothing about climate change, pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and in fact, deleted the words climate change from the federal government's websites. But what's really amazing is that 24 states ignored the federal government, stuck with the Paris Agreement, and kept right on decreasing their emissions. 24 states, including Connecticut, representing 55% of the population. Many cities, 438 mayors agreed to stick with that agreement and to reduce their energy use to purely renewable energy. Many of them have already reached their goals. They're running on 100% renewables already. I used to worry a lot about the corporations of America. I still do. They're some of the biggest polluters. But there are three big reasons that's changing. There are three groups putting huge pressure on corporations to clean up their act. There is, of course, the public, right? We want them to be cleaner. There are investors who are putting pressure on companies to clean up. Here's a little secret. Most experts think that sometime in the next couple of decades, there's going to be a carbon tax or carbon pricing scheme whereby if you pollute, you pay. And there's this one really great program that suggests that the money the polluters pay goes into our bank accounts, the citizens. That one's popular with both Republicans and Democrats. Anyway, so the day that carbon tax happens, all the big polluters are in big trouble. The airlines, the cruise lines, the oil companies. So investors are really turned on to this, and they don't want to be shafted when that day comes. And then the third group is the employees of these companies. 2 years ago, Amazon didn't even have a climate program. And then the employees basically had a mutiny. And now Amazon said, okay, we're buying 100,000 electric vans. We're putting $10 billion into climate science, and so on. I mean, some of the tech companies are the biggest movers and shakers when it comes to reducing emissions. Google has used 100% renewable since 2017. Apple is aiming to be 100% carbon neutral by 2030, not just what the company itself burns, but also all their suppliers and all of the customers using their laptops and iPhones. Taking all of that together, they intend to be carbon neutral. That doesn't mean they won't produce carbon. They will, but they will offset it by investing in forests, setting up new solar and wind farms, and so on. And Microsoft Microsoft not only intends to be carbon neutral, by 2050, they intend to have removed from the air all the carbon dioxide they've ever pumped out since they were founded in 1979. That's a pretty cool goal. I mean, we'll see if they do it, but that's their stated goal. So in the end, there are really two reasons to prepare for climate change. The first is the obvious one, because if you're readier, you will save your home, save your kids, save money, save your life. But there's a second reason that's sort of a stealth reason, and that is that the one known antidote for depression is taking control of your situation, a situation you feel like you're helpless about. So making preparation steps makes you feel better. It means you've taken some action about this helpless situation. So those are the two reasons to prepare for this disastrous thing that we know is coming. We just can't say what the date is. I do believe that in the next 50 or 80 years, we will decarbonize society. You just have to look at the young people today and what they care about to see that. I mean, we stick in the mud oldsters are going to die off, and young people who care about living cleanly and greenly are going to replace us. But until that day, you really have only one big thing in your control, and that is to prepare. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you have, and if we don't get to them now, there's my email address. Feel free to email me at any time. And of course, if you buy the book, I would be delighted to sign an autographed sticker for you that you can slap in.